we met to discuss this search for primes, but as our mathematical discussions unfolded, it began to become clear that we had a problem. And the problem was that Watkins felt that he had discovered an error in the mathematical formulation of the wave, what it was. And I understood that if he was right, as he thought he was, that I was in deep shit indeed, because if he was right, I had made a mistake, made a blunder. An error was Watkins' position. And it was a difficult experience for me, not only because I didn't know how I was going to feed myself if this thing went up in smoke, but it was very hard for me to understand Watkins. It's mine, I invented it, but I can't defend it in academic mathematical terms. I don't think of myself as Einstein, certainly, but there is a story about Einstein that after he published the general theory of relativity, a physicist named Hermann Bondi launched a furious attack on it. And Niels Bohr went to Einstein and he said, Bondi is saying all these things, he's publishing all these papers, what are you going to do about it? And Einstein said, I can't do anything about it, I cannot understand the man's objection. So this was the position I found myself in. Watkins was terrifying. I never had the guts to ask him how old he was. My guess would be 19, something like that. I mean, just one of these flaming geniuses, just one of these people for whom quadratic equations came like walking, And so we had this series of, I thought of it as the meetings by the pool. We had 3 long meetings by the pool where my world wilted, curled, melted, retracted, and finally it was very sort of sad, actually. And but it wasn't definitive, because I could not understand him. And he was also, I think even he would agree, arrogant in that way that you're trained to be in the British university system. I mean, you are to be scathing, you are to take no prisoners. And he said, I want to write a paper about your wave. And I said, fine, and we'll put it on the website. And he said, what I'm going to put forward my objection. He said, what shall I call the paper? And I said, well, how about Autopsy for a Mathematical Hallucination? When you really get into the spirit of this thing, you say, let me guide the knife. Let me turn on the saw. Don't trouble yourself. So how about Autopsy for a Mathematical Hallucination? And he said, fine. And then he did it. And it was, several pages of mathematical notation and several nasty paragraphs. And I sat with it for months. And then I said, I can't really understand Watkins, but I do understand what I intended. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to answer his objection by, once again, as clearly as possible, defining my methods and putting that on the internet, and then let the chips fall where they may, and some third party will have to resolve all this. So I did that, and Watkins took a leave of absence, and I understand he was last seen somewhere in the west of Ireland with a donkey and a harp. And he basically then just dismissed the whole thing and said, well, you're a cult, your people are morons, you can't even understand this objection, and this whole thing is really boring to me. And so then it was sort of left like that. But I got good support from my mathematical friends, and Ralph Abraham was wonderful, and he said, he told all kinds of stories from the history of mathematics about people who had made enormous blunders whose names are still enshrined in the stars, and on and on. But I really felt shaky about the whole thing, and I talked about it at Esalen. But Watkins never dealt with the fact that the wave did describe time. He wasn't interested in that. He just said, you made a mistake, and so why should we talk any further? You made a mistake. And so trying to say, that it adds up or it looks good or so far, you made a mistake. Well, in the past 7-8 months, I've been working very quietly with a person who came out of the woodwork. So all I can tell you is he is a professional mathematician. His ordinary job is modeling thermonuclear fusion processes for the United States government at a desert installation somewhere in the American Southwest. His mathematical credentials are impeccable, and he said, I want to go to bedrock with this Watkins thing, and I'm going to do a complete vector analysis of the wave and break it down at every level, formalize every step, and try to understand what has happened here, because he, like me, liked the theory. So we've been working very quietly, or rather, I've been reading his email, and he has been working. And here's what we come up with. It turns out that the mistake I made was tiny. It's wrong by 3%. There's a 3% difference between this wave and the wave that all parties have now converged upon as, in fact, the true wave. We call this the time wave, TW. We're calling the new one the CTW, the corrected time wave. My mistake was as Watkins defined it, but he never carried through. Something about his way of thinking was, once he discovered I'd made a mistake, for him, he felt that, if we think of it as a game, that he had won the game. He never went on to see what the consequences of the mistake were. And the consequences of the mistake were to distort the values by overall 3%. Hundreds of screens are within less than 1% difference of each other. The overall conclusions that come out of these 2 years of mathematical hell that we've embroiled in is actually we're now in more robust shape than ever, because thanks to this gentleman's work, which will be posted on the internet shortly, and all of you who have Time Wave Zero software, we're going to put a file up which you will be able to download and pull out the bad values, plug in the good values, and then the interface will run the new wave for you. Good news from my point of view is that in the process of this going on, the time wave has gone from being the mathematical hallucination of Terence McKenna to a vetted formalism, having been hammered on and had its tires kicked by some of the best mathematicians in the business. All stages in the construction of the wave are now formally defined. The overall effect of adopting the corrected time wave is truly good news, and it should be surprise to no one. It turns out the universe is even more novel than I thought it was, because the new time wave tends to start closer to zero and hew closer to it as it moves along. So the overall picture that emerges is of a more novel universe than we thought we had before. And then, and this is, to my mind, the ultimate payback, though I have always argued publicly, feeling it was the obligation of the public to be my opposition, I've always been aware of a couple of things that were puzzling to me. One of them was, why is it that plunge into novelty in the 10th century for the Umayyad Caliphates reaches a greater depth of novelty than the founding moment of Islam 200 years before, when it seems derivative of Islam? And I just held this in my mind. I felt, I need to study the Umayyad Caliphates. I need to study the foundation of Islam. I need to figure out why this is. But it always irked me. Nobody ever mentioned it to me or pointed it out. I discovered this slight discrepancy in my own intuition about how the wave should work. I also discovered another slight discrepancy about my intuition how the wave should work, which is, I always felt that the novelty graph for World War II should reach the greatest descent into novelty at the use of the atomic bombs over Japan. After all, a new physical principle is involved. But I always knew that by the old time wave, the winter of 43 was weighted as slightly more novel than the August of 45. And this troubled me. I'm happy to report that with the corrections in place, both of these problems have been rectified, and now the founding moment of Islam is more novel, slightly, than the Umayyad Caliphates, and the use of atomic weapons over Japan is more novel, slightly, than the Battle of Stalingrad. And there are a couple of other areas, too technical or too obscurantus to go into at the moment, but to me, it was a win-win situation. The only slightly galling thing about the whole thing was I personally have to admit that I made and defended for 22 years or however long it was a 3% skew of the values because I made a methodological error in the scoring of the time wave. Now that that's corrected and that we have a complete vector analysis of the entire wave, and it is now a completely explicit mathematical object that any trained mathematician in the world can now answer any conceivable question that might be put about its formalism, we're ready for prime time, I think. Remember, I've talked for years about history's fractal mountain. We have been moving upward into habit, and on September 7th it will turn down. We are now undergoing a series of oscillations before 2012. I'll leave this up after this evening, or for the rest of this evening, and if you care to stay after the lecture, you can play with it. There's always people in the room who know how to rescale it and run it for you. I don't know how well you can see these, but do you see that it's damn near at this scale the same wave? But in fact, it is not the same wave. Okay, so that's history's fractal mountain. This is what I thought it was. This is what the new vetted, corrected, and cleaned up version turns it out to be. Here are some more examples. This is from, now this one is more dramatically different. This is from 213. Here's the one that shows one of the places where I myself had doubts. This is the period from 1935 to 1955. In other words, including all of World War II. Here's the old version, new version. And as yeah, the 45 is weighted heavier here, and 43 is weighted heavier here. So it's amazing to me that I could have claimed for 22 years that it described time, argued all these cases, finally gotten it straightened out, and discovered that it describes time even better than it did before.
Have you found any new discrepancies or anything? Have you had a chance to really go through the whole thing really with a fine-tooth comb?
No, see, I haven't yet actually had a chance to load the new data into my own version of Time Wave Zero. When I do, I'll go through really with a fine-tooth comb, as you say, because there are about 50 or 60 historical incidents that are indices for this. They all have to be looked at. Now, here are two that are quite different. This is 1915. Old version, new version. Now, the World War II began in 1914.
World War I.
Sorry, World War I. I said it began in one? Couldn't be. No, yes, World War I began in 1914. So again, you see that the new data is much more congruent with the facts of the matter. Well, here's one. This is the one we've always argued over all these many years, and it's interesting. This is the one basically from the fall of Rome to the present. Old version, remember, and here's foundation of Islam, Umayyad Caliphate. You've practically memorized this stuff. Black Death. I know there's the Black Death, and there's the Renaissance, and there's the Enlightenment. Here's the new version. Quite interestingly different. Much food for thought. So bottom line is, as I said, all I had to do to make this a field of genuine human study and endeavor instead of my own little bailiwick is admit that I made a mistake, which I freely do. I did make a mistake, and I should say I'm grateful to all of the people who participated in this. I don't mind. I've never feared the knife. And
including the young mathematician.
Yes, Watkins first and foremost, because he put his finger on the error, and then it all proceeded from there. And the whole thing has been, since its conception in 1971, moving slowly toward a process of being an ever more robust object in the theater of intellectual discourse.